Wow, this is great. We've been looking forward to this ever since we started a massive planning process. And so I want to formally welcome you all to the first of several welcomes, really, to this year's Trina Grillo Public Interest and Social Justice Law Retreat, which we've titled Human Rights at Home and Abroad. A welcome that is exciting and, I must say, incredibly poignant as we gather at Trina's home base, my colleague and my friend, from which she did so much of her great work. Remarkably, this is the 13th time we've gathered to remember Trina and to carry on the struggle in which she engaged so valiantly during her sadly brief time on the planet. The power of her work and the longevity of this retreat demonstrate the power of her legacy. As I say, this is not a time for extended welcoming remarks. Tomorrow, when we all gather, I'm honored to have been asked to provide context for the critically important work of this year's retreat and to reflect on my friend and colleague and the crucial role that all of us must play in the struggle for justice. Tonight, there is more important work at hand. To hear from our wonderful keynote speaker, to schmooze, to renew old acquaintances, to meet new comrades, and to hear from our, as I say, courageous speaker, Beth Coy, retired Navy commander, to whom we all owe a debt of gratitude. There's one thing I will say tomorrow that must be repeated here, and those are words of thanks. The Trina Grillo Retreat is a major undertaking engaged in by collaborative work of 12 Western law schools stretching from Washington to Los Angeles to the Rockies. Each year a law school takes the leading oar. This year, USF. And believe me, and I think you know, this is no simple task. So let us all offer sincere gratitude to the schools listed in your program. To each of the schools, and particularly to my colleagues in the dean's offices, I say this. In these difficult times, we must collaborate in the struggle for justice. Our resources are too thin, and our effectiveness diminished if we try to do it alone. We need to inspire each other and to support each other. Too often we compete in ways that are counterproductive and sometimes silly and sometimes embarrassing. The Grillo Retreat is proof positive that together great law schools with their own individual strengths and personalities can come together to, as we say at USF, and I'm sure all of the schools say in their own way, to educate minds and hearts to change the world. To all participating schools, my deep thanks for leading the way. And of course, others also deserve special thanks. Co-host SALT, the liaisons of each of the schools who help coordinate the panels and the programs, and my deepest thanks to USF's Dean's Office, including Assistant Dean for Student Affairs, Aaron Dolly, and Student Affairs Program Assistant, Jillian Fish. There's one other person that deserves thanks, Hazel Weiser, Executive Director of SALT, who will introduce our keynote speaker and has done so much to organize all of us on so many issues, whether it be getting rid of the disgrace of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, protecting clinical legal education from partisan political attack, or supporting the rights of workers striking hotels where our profession's conferences are too frequently held. Indeed, the last time Hazel and I talked was not on the phone or through email, although God knows I receive more emails from Hazel than I do from my wife, but on the picket line in front of the Hilton Hotel in January. Hazel Weiser has been the Executive Director of SALT since 2007 She enrolled in Brooklyn Law School after working with street kids and runaways, where she came to understand that without a knowledge of the law, her role as an advocate would indeed be limited. After graduation, she moved to San Francisco, working as a plaintiff's antitrust and later a criminal defense attorney. She joined the Academy full-time in 1985 at JFK, where she served as Associate Dean and taught federal jurisdiction, constitutional law, and appellate advocacy. In 1978, Hazel moved back to New York and joined the faculty of Toro Law School, where she conceived the academic support program and became the director of legal writing. After 10 years of service at Toro, she left to work with local nonprofits, and she was director in her last job before SALT of the Foundation for Advancement at the Long Island Community Foundation, which she did for 5 years. Most critically, this multi-talented multitasker has a theater background, as well as writing, directing, producing, and performing in the San Francisco theater scene, including writing scripts and performing for something called Surrealist San Francisco, which seems to me a redundancy, and which Hazel describes as, quote, a terrible public radio show. A description I seriously doubt if Hazel's great work in the struggle for human rights is any guide. Hazel Weiser, welcome, and welcome all.
Thank you, Jeff. So, since 1974, the Society of American Law Teachers has been a force for inclusion and change in law schools, and consequently in the legal profession. We call ourselves a community of progressive law teachers working for justice, diversity, and academic excellence. SALT is the only legal organization that includes law teachers, deans, librarians, career services and admissions officers, and adjunct professors too. Some of your best professors here at USF are members of SALT. Through our committee, SALT helps young law teachers bring distinctive and diverse voices and perspectives onto faculties and into their scholarship. And through critiquing how law schools function, SALT advances the ideal that the students sitting in law school classrooms across this country should reflect the true demographics of our nation. Our committees strive for academic freedom and equal opportunity within law schools, human rights and access to justice in our communities, and equality without categories. Is Raquel here? Raquel Aldana? Is she here? No. All right, I'll introduce you to her tomorrow. She's one of the co-presidents of SALT and a woman I greatly admire. She teaches at McGeorge. But we couldn't operate without the support of law school deans who open their schools to inquiry, fellowship, and community, as Dean Jeff Brandt has done tonight in hosting the 13th annual Trina Grillo Public Interest and Social Justice Retreat. And I thank you, Dean Brandt, for your generosity, and I'll walk any picket line with you anytime, okay? In our fancy cashmere coats, right? And I also want to thank Erin Dolly, Assistant Dean for Students here at USF, who has coordinated this weekend's retreat with vitality and caring and vision, keeping in mind the legacy of Professor Trina Grillo, so that infused within this program are opportunities for all of us to be human with each other. Social change requires empathy, kindness, and respect, as well as risk, struggle, and truth. Tonight, I am incredibly honored to introduce Beth Coy, retired naval commander, a woman who has taken enormous risk, sacrificed her personal dream, and joined forces with a diverse and often rowdy social movement that included men and women, including Lady Gaga, dedicated to repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Commander Coy has the Navy in her blood. Her father was an admiral. Commander Coy is a graduate of Wellesley College, class of 1959, a class that included many women who forged the path of new feminism, including Madeleine Albright, the first woman Secretary of State who served under President Clinton. I know Beth through Winnie Freund, another member of that incredible class of 1959 who's been my mentor and friend. Commander Coy earned a BA in International Relations from American University and a certificate in Naval Warfare from the Naval War College. Her first struggle in the Navy was to author a study that would become the benchmark for opening military opportunities for women. Her experience prying open the door to women in the military services is chronicled in a 1998 novel, My Navy Too, which she co-wrote with 6 writers, including 2 other Wellesley graduates from the class of 1959, including Esther Bell, and 2 men, including her mentor, Vice Admiral Bain. Her next struggle got even more personal, and that's why we've invited her to speak with you tonight. Commander Coy risked, struggled, and spoke the truth about the impact of the discriminatory Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy on the individual lives of service members and consequently on the state of our nation. She is here to tell us her story and how her personal risk, struggle, and truth-telling as part of a larger movement led to the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell on December 18th, 2010. I present you retired Naval Commander Beth Coy.
Thank you, Hazel, for your special and warm introduction. And thank you for giving me the distinct honor to address this illustrious group of lawyers and future lawyers. And also, I'm very tickled that my longtime companion of over 30 years, Esther, and classmate, Wellesley 59, is with me tonight. I hesitated to say yes to Hazel and Aaron, and that I'm not a lawyer, though my first duty station from 1960 to 62 was the Naval Justice School in Newport, Rhode Island. And that's where we had at that time, two personnel billets who were waves, women, in the Navy. Women accepted for voluntary emergency service, as a matter of fact. And the others were 17 officers were all Navy lawyers or JAG officers, including the commanding officer and the executive officer. So I feel somewhat comfortable with among lawyers. I've titled my talk, Truth in Action. To quote Benjamin Disraeli, "Sir, I say that justice is truth in action." As Hazel said, I'll be talking about how Don't Ask, Don't Tell was taken down from an activist viewpoint. These last 5 years, I participated with a core player in our federal rulemaking process, the interest groups. As a member of the Service Members Legal Defense Network, or we call ourselves SLDN, serving on both its Military Advisory Council and then the Military Outreach Committee, I've been a very alive activist seeking the truth in action. I've also been active as a member of the Foreign Forum on Military Chaplaincy, a group of military chaplains, progressive clergy, and committed laity determined to counterbalance the largely conservative military chaplaincy. Tonight we'll look at repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell as a quasi-case study in the federal rulemaking processes. I agree with Cornelius Kerwin, the president, now president of American University, who names 6 players in the process of rulemaking at the federal level: the Congress, the president, agencies or departments, the media, interest groups, and the courts. I would add a seventh player, and that's you all, the American people. To change this military rule, don't ask, don't tell, all 7 players participated vigorously, I mean intensely, in the rulemaking process, as you no doubt already realize. Working within the rulemaking processes are the public advocates, the lawyers, whose job is to present honest, ethical information to essential individuals and groups engaged in rulemaking or rule changing. Some of you will be in this position someday, and many of you may have already been. President Kerwin says the interest groups and the agencies slant departments, so that's 2. Those represent the core players with which public advocates work as rules are made and laws are changed. Tonight we'll focus on the nature of the activists who work behind the scenes in any social movement, with a short personal perspective, as Hazel said, from me on how discrimination has affected my own life. I'll briefly describe the interest groups involved in the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Then we'll explore how the 7 rulemaking players interacted with each other to change the laws for military gays and lesbians. How do we move bureaucracies in the United States towards fairer, more just human rights, change laws, and put truth into action? Big question. Mainly, we create social movements. And within social movements, there are interest groups. And within interest groups, the individual activist comes alive. Howard Thurman, an influential theologian and civil rights leader, once said, quote, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive." What then are the ingredients for individual activists to come alive and work for freedom and justice for all? From my perspective, it has a great deal to do with the phenomenon Jane O'Reilly, most of you are too young to remember her, but anyway, Jane O'Reilly labeled the clique, which she wrote about in 1971 in Ms. Magazine's premiere issue. O'Reilly described the clique as an awakening of feminist consciousness. This clique, incidentally, could describe an awakening to any form of discrimination and denial of human rights. The awakening creates activists. Remember Disraeli, "Sir, I say that justice is truth in action." The clique is an awakening to the truth. My first clique occurred as I faced the sting of discrimination as a Navy woman. In 1965, I was denied a top assignment, even though I graduated #1 in our class of 36 male officers, and me, from American University's International Relations Master's Program. Having served with so many activists who were working to change laws for military women in the 1970s, and then for military gays in the last 5 years, my simple answer to what drives an activist is that it's a matter of nature and nurture. Those innate attributes and life experiences that sustain one throughout the journey, a journey that is sometimes very painful, yet always deeply fulfilling. For me, the moral courage to fight for Navy women, juxtaposed with living a lie as a closeted military lesbian, flowed from many sources: the love from my parents, love of my country, a solid liberal education, overriding internal values of justice and freedom for all, and love from partners, friends, and other family members. Activists are people who need people, in a big way. Later on in my journey, my spiritual community, Unitarian Universalism, and its members rose up again and again in support of my activist work. This community has sustained my spiritual needs for over 15 years. My second clique came in 1979 in my last assignment, my command tour. During these 2.5 years, I discharged at least 8 young men and women for cause of homosexuality. So here I was, commanding officer, sitting behind the desk, accepting that, saying that they were going to have to leave the Navy for cause of homosexuality. Each discharge tore at my heart and soul. I was sending home young, competent sailors again and again. Almost 2 years into the command assignment, a stunning event occurred. I learned that my commander, who was a captain and the head of the Naval Training Center, wished to force me out of command. He had put a tail on me for several weeks to prove his suspicion that I was a lesbian. Fear and a sense of betrayal rushed through me. The organizational and bureaucratic entity I fondly call Big Daddy Navy did not trust me, and I certainly no longer trusted him to honor my own integrity. After this breach of trust, the next discharge of 2 young lesbians became the pivotal turning point. This completed the awakening to my own consciousness as a lesbian and member of the then fledgling gay community, 1980. I had come out to my parents the year before. When I told Dad, who knew of my sexual orientation, that I was contemplating early retirement, he counseled me to stay in the Navy and said, "You'll make Captain, Beth, and who knows, perhaps you'll be our first Lady Admiral." To know me is to know that I very much wanted to make captain. Since my father was an admiral, I figured I should at least be a captain. My assignment officer told me he was sending me to the Pentagon to a captain's billet, and he expected me to be selected at the next captain's selection board. It was an agonizing decision. My deepest roots from birth were my family in the United States Navy. But after 21 years of having to hide my sexual orientation, I felt I had little choice. In order to maintain my integrity and sanity, I needed to say goodbye to a professional relationship with the United States Navy. Unlike my work for military women, I could not be my true self and speak up and out for the rights of military gays and lesbians. I retired with regret on 1 September 1980 without making captain. Though I will always be a retired naval officer, once I stepped into the civilian world, I was gradually able to take back my life as a woman, a lesbian, and an activist. We turn now briefly to the LGBT community, the interest group that has been at the heart of the rulemaking story of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Since 1778, when George Washington dismissed a lieutenant for a same-sex relationship with another soldier, the U.S. military has had discriminatory policies prohibiting gay behaviors, 1778. But it was not until 1993 that Congress passed and President Clinton signed legislation about military gays. This compromise Don't Ask, Don't Tell legislation, which is still in effect right now as I speak, holds that, quote, "The presence in the armed services of persons who demonstrate a propensity or intent to engage in homosexual acts would create an unacceptable risk to the high standards of morale and discipline and good order and unit cohesion, which are the essence of military capability," unquote. Well, you can imagine how these phrases, uttered ad nauseum by anti-repeal public officials and senior military leaders on active duty, feel to that gay service member even today as he or she waits for certification, implementation, and finally repeal. Just think about those words I read to you. Interest groups in the LGBT or gay movement are significantly fewer in number in their democratic base than those in the second wave of feminism, or in the women's movement, or also the civil rights movement, at least at their heights. Think about it. Women are 51% or so of our population. African Americans have been approximately 13% of the U.S. population since the 1960s, and gays and lesbians are about 4 or 5%, depends on whom you talk to, but we'll say 4 or 5% of the population. No wonder it took straight allies such as SALT, thank you, and PFLAG and the Center for American Progress, the more moderate to progressive religious institutions, and others to bring about this major, major piece of civil rights legislation in 2010, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. To take down Don't Ask, Don't Tell, more than 15 substantial interest groups worked tirelessly and mounted campaigns to raise the necessary funding to successfully lobby and win the hearts and minds of both legislators and the American people. Among these are Service Members Legal Defense Network, one of the leaders, Service Members United, the Human Rights Campaign, Get Equal, Nights Out. Nights Out are those who graduated from West Point, and in your We Are Family Too, you have quite a few of those Nights Out who wrote letters. USNA Out, that's the Naval Academy, those who are gay and lesbian and graduates of the Naval Academy. Courage Campaign, Center for American Progress, and the Palm Center right here in Southern California, Santa Barbara. There was a monthly roundtable conference call that kept the planning somewhat cohesive and on point. Differences of opinions and actions occurred, but the goal was the same: bring down Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Groups in opposition to repeal were most veterans groups, retired and active duty senior military officers, the family values groups, the conservative religious groups, including military chaplains, and Elaine Donnelly and her Center for Military Readiness. The majority of active duty military chaplains, including their leaders, are from conservative denominations. By that I mean the three chiefs of the Army, Chief of Chaplain, the Navy, and the Air Force are all evangelical. That's another subject. We remind ourselves that the military as an institution, by its very nature, is fairly conservative. The blinders were tightly fastened. As I mentioned earlier, I serve with SLDN, one of the prominent Repeal, Don't Ask, Don't Tell interest groups. SLDN has a board of directors, a small staff, including several lawyers, at least 3 or 4, and a brilliant executive director, Aubrey Sarvis. Through the years, SLDN has sustained a military advisory council composed of retired and former veterans, such as myself, largely gays and lesbians, though some straight, who were willing to lobby and speak out publicly across the nation. During my lobbying, I relearned that communications, or lack thereof, are often a problem, right? We know that. I came to understand more clearly our opponent's position. Much of their concern about repeal was due to lack of knowledge about the gay community and what it is to be a gay man or a lesbian. I spent many an hour, probably not enough, trying to educate Republicans who seemed to know little about gays and lesbians. One of those Republicans was John Snyder, who was the senior administrator in my own congressman's home office in Medford, just 20 minutes from Ashland, where I live. To my surprise, on 23 December, only a few days after the final vote to repeal, among the many emails that crossed my computer's monitor was from John. He wrote, "Congratulations on the recent victory on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. You fought the battle long and steadfastly and with incredible class. Have a great holiday. Thanks, John." So, those are our opponents. Sometimes you think they're not real people, but here John's a real person. He had listened and heard the other side of the argument. His boss and my congressman, Greg Walden, as well as 174 other Republicans, did not vote in favor of repeal. But at least some of Congressman Walden's personnel had respectfully listened to the case for repeal and learned more about the gay community. We veterans worked as a team, with rank or rating often not a factor as to assumption of leadership. We were united by courage, strength, determination, and respect for our country. We knew teamwork was paramount for success, and while we had our differences with some of the other anti-Don't Ask, Don't Tell interest groups' tactics, not everybody thinks alike, we kept our eye on the prize, the downfall of a law that has held at least the 65,000 or more military gays in the total force hostage. That's right now, at least 65,000 we can project, probably a lot more. The sword of Damocles hanging over their heads every day, as it did for me for those years. At times, we gay and lesbian vets felt like outsiders, removed from our beloved military. In emails, we often quoted military or political leaders, or used the language of our military subculture to cheer ourselves onwards. We who came from the naval branches would shout out, "Bravo Zulu," to our fellow activists who had scored in some way towards reaching our goal. Bravo Zulu are the naval signal flags for well done. Bravo Zulu, so you can say that to one, at least to one Navy person, or they won't know what you're talking about unless they're Navy, but that's okay. The Marines would email a Semper Fi, and the Coasties a Semper Paratus. We had all services, all 5 of them. We vowed to each other, especially in the hard times, to never, never, never give in. Words from Winston Churchill to the Harrow School on October 29th, 1941. Churchill said, quote, "This is the lesson. Never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never." Unquote. Or as we say in the Navy, don't give up the ship. By 2010, all 7 rulemaking players were at the height of their game. Sparks were flying throughout America about gays in the military. The entire country seemed to be attuned to the dialogue. Probably right here in San Francisco, I'm sure. Let's look briefly at the rulemakers who played hard. Remember I talked about the 7 rulemakers earlier on in the repeal, don't ask, don't tell rulemaking game. They're not in any priority, just the way I'm telling the story. The agency or the department, those are interrelated. And in this case, it was a department. The Department of Defense's, or DOD's, constant position since 1993 had been the defense of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law and policy, stating that it is incumbent upon the Congress to change the law and not DOD. And as a personal note, I found it utterly frustrating as first a woman in the Navy and then a lesbian retiree fighting for rule changing, to be treated as a group like a political football by both the military and the Congress, with neither rulemaker willing to be the quarterback. This is why the minority, as represented by interest groups, the courts, and the media, had to become the quarterback sometimes and call the plays. This situation represents what, if you remember John Stuart Mill in your undergraduate perhaps, referred to as the tyranny of the majority, right? And it's hard when you're the minority. By early 2010, however, pressures and actions within the U.S. from many sources, media, senior retired officers who are willing to stand up and be counted, congressional inquiries, personal stories as presented by interest groups, active duty gays in the courts, and somebody was talking about Major Witt, who you worked with back here, and she's up in Washington. She was one of the court cases. Finally hit a tipping point, and at the February 3rd Senate Armed Services Committee hearings, both the Secretary of Defense, Gates, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Evan Mullen, took strong personal positions in favor of repeal. It was in February. Some of you remember that, I'm sure. On a personal note, when the chairman, Admiral Mike Mullen, testified that to lift the military's gay ban, quote, is the right thing to do, unquote, that's what he says, the right thing to do. At last, my trust with Big Daddy Navy had been reestablished. Yeah, just hit me. The individual uniformed services, chiefs, the individual uniformed service chiefs, like the Chief of Staff of the Army and Chief of Naval Operations and so forth, testified against repeal at that time. All asked for delays, arguing, John McCain was in on it, oh, little I can see nodding head, yeah. Arguing they needed to read the Pentagon study on gays to be published in December before they could make any recommendation. We must remember that the Department of Defense, or DOD, is led by civilians, and that the service chiefs report to these secretaries, like CNO, Chief Naval Operations, reports to Secretary of the Navy. These civilians, all appointed by the President, were all likely in favor of repeal. Okay, that's the first of the 7. The next is the interest groups. The innumerable interest groups, both for and against repeal, worked at a fever pitch throughout the entire year, knowing that with a new Congress in 2011, the numbers and the leadership might be lacking. One initiative that I felt gratified to be a part of was We Are Family Too, a book of letters, which is on that table and some of you picked up, written by former and retired gay veterans, both lesbians and gay men, to introduce themselves and tell their personal stories to the Pentagon Working Group. Copies are in the back, as we've said. As editor and distributor of We Are Family Too, I followed the book's journey from the Pentagon to the White House and the Congress. In fact, when we took it, I wasn't able to go back to Washington, but when some of my colleagues took it into the Pentagon Working Group, they said, this should go over there, and they pointed across the Potomac. They wanted it to go to the Congress and the White House. You know, this was important, and they said, they're the ones you have to convince. Well, we also had to convince the Pentagon. So, as the editor, as I say, I followed across, and Hazel helped in some of the distribution. Many of my friends whom I were new to me helped me get this distributed. And I began to feel less of an outsider knocking on closed doors and more of a player. Because, you know, it's a strange feeling. Here I've been in the Navy for 21 years, and actually I grew up in it, so I like to say it's 42 years when I retired. You know, and here they were saying you're not welcome to come. They did not, the Pentagon Working Group did not ask any retired gays and lesbians to serve on the group, which seems a little whatever, but that was their choice. They said that if they had us serve, then they'd have to ask the Elaine Donnellys of the crowd, which wasn't a good reason, I thought. But anyway, we activists, working as outside, unpaid consultants with the Pentagon Working Group, we knew we were having an impact when we heard an anecdote about General Ham. By the way, General Carter Ham has been in the news, if anybody follows. He's the CENTCOM for Asia, Africa right now, and he's a big deal. Well, that is Carter Ham. He was the 4-star general and the senior officer on the group. Seems that shortly after this was the Military Outreach Committee group, and we had several initiatives. We Are Family Too was one, but another was what we call Gay 101, and this was, these provided well, definitions and language to straight people who didn't ever think about it. Well, really. And the general, one of the officers, so we delivered that, the initiative, which provided the definition. The general was in a closed session with some senior officers not too long after we gave him that Gay 101. And one of the officers in this briefing talked about those homosexuals. And the general stopped the conversation and said, don't call them homosexuals. They like to be called gays and lesbians. From this day forward, we will call them gays and lesbians. Well, I thought that was, actually, we thought that was pretty cool. Because if you think about it, he may not have known that he's met quite a few gays and lesbians right in his military, in the Army or wherever. But they can't say anything. So for all he knows, he's not met very many, if any, gays and lesbians. So, but that was a good attitude, you know. We're not going to call them, if they don't want to be called homosexuals, we're going to call them what they want to be called, gays and lesbians. The next rule maker is the White House or the President. Throughout 2010, several high-level talks occurred in the White House with the LGBT interest groups and anti-repeal interest groups. Gay activists, including me, would have preferred a stronger voice and more leadership from the President and his staff, but they chose to take the moderate centrist path. That's what they chose. And hey, it paid off in the long run. The fourth is the what we call the fourth estate. Everybody's heard that. If you took Poli-Sci 101, that's the media. Mainstream media, and of course the LGBT media, for years have been supportive of repeal through editorials. All the big New York Times, I'm sure San Francisco Chronicle, but all the big newspapers have written many editorials in support of lifting the ban. And they also had lots of anecdotal stories and reportage of significant studies about military gays. They really did a superb job, in my opinion. And the studies always, of course, recommend, from way back when, recommended that, to lift the ban was a very good idea, and that we needed to change the rule and the policy. But I personally got involved in this journey with newspapers, and I must say that they were so supportive all the way for me, and I had many an article in there that I was just surprised that the reporters were terrific and they wanted to publish it. So it was really remarkable, and I appreciated that as the activists involved, that the media did pick up on it. The next is the courts. You may have followed more closely the several court cases in which former and active duty military members sued the government. As you all are aware, filing suit is one means of changing the law. In this instance, the suit brought forth by the log cabin Republicans, you all know who they are, they're the gays and lesbians who happen to be Republicans, so that's what their group is. The log cabin Republicans in the Ninth Circuit Court was the most significant in terms of affecting rulemaking. This is a broader-based case than some of the others and could take down Don't Ask, Don't Tell as unconstitutional. Indeed, in September 2010, you remember this, U.S. District Court Judge Virginia Phillips ruled in favor of repeal, declaring Don't Ask, Don't Tell as what we already knew, unconstitutional, and the policy as in violation of the First Amendment rights and due process. She wrote that Don't Ask, Don't Tell had a, quote, direct and deleterious effect on the military, unquote. The log cabin case was meant to hold the government's feet to the fire and take down Don't Ask, Don't Tell from a legal standpoint, and this often happens in this rulemaking. The case is still open, and in a footnote to the government's brief to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, the government wrote, quote, the Department of Justice in this case has followed its long-standing practice of defending the constitutionality of federal statutes as long as reasonable arguments can be made in support of their constitutionality, unquote. However, since the repeal was passed in December, the Department of Justice has asked the Ninth Circuit to put the appeal in abeyance, quote unquote. But the court has refused that motion, and things are still happening in that particular case. 6. Another player in rulemaking, as I said, is what I would say is the public or the people. In a democracy, we pay attention to what the people say and desire. I'm sounding like I was a professor of political science 101 and 102, so you'll have to forgive me, but I'm lecturing to you now. Through their elected officials and the other 6 players, the people's voice comes through loud and clear. A perfect example of the people speaking truth to power was an event last October, the first Southern Oregon Pride weekend in Rogue Valley in Ashland. Rogue Valley is where I live, Nestor and I. The Social Action Justice Committee within my church, the Rogue Valley UU Fellowship, played a key role in orchestrating the Southern Oregon Pride weekend, including a special parade down Ashland's main street. We UUs had 2 floats with 2 UU ministers, one on each, including my own minister, officiating in lesbian and gay weddings. I sat in the cab of the first truck, waving to the crowd that lined Main Street. Below my open window hung a poster with my name, rank, and service, and the symbol for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I was overcome with joy and amazement to see families, straight and gay, students, people of color, all waving back to me, cheering and clapping for marriage equality and repeal of the military ban on gays. And in fact, of course, I cried, too. Straight allies marching down my hometown streets with open members of the gay community, including me, was something I'd never dreamed could happen in my own lifetime. National polls as to whether gays should serve openly grew increasingly over the last decade to a resounding 70% in favor, give or take, but that's what it mostly comes out as. Additionally, in this specific instance, the military, via the Pentagon study that I'd mentioned in 2010, polled service members and their families and came out with the same conclusion. It's time to lift the gay ban, the ban on military gays. And the seventh, is the Congress, including political parties obviously involved in this. With strong leadership from Congressman Patrick Murphy, sponsor of an amendment that would repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, House leaders and strong proponents of repeal, the House passed the broad-based Defense Authorization Bill, which included the Don't Ask, Don't Tell as an amendment in May of 2010. Considerable negotiations had taken place prior to that vote. For instance, I was saying to Hazel that one of them, we had to pull the non-discrimination clause that was in the original statute. That's been pulled. So those negotiated in order to assuage more conservative representatives and garner votes. We needed to get more votes. The Senate attempted to pass the same bill in October, the bill which was the full Defense Authorization Bill with the Don't Ask, Don't Tell amendment. It failed by 56 to 43 vote. We needed 60 for cloture. Senator Susan Collins and the more moderate Republicans chose not to go along with the broad-based Defense Authorization Bill for procedural reasons, sounds like the Senate, though she and several Republicans expressed their support for repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. In these votes, we saw the power of our political party system. Senator Joseph Lieberman, the sponsor of the amendment, and Senator Collins, they're pretty close friends, then chose to press for a standalone repeal bill for passage in this lame duck session. By luck, much hard work and negotiation, some of it was just pure luck, as life can be and legislation can be, the bill passed the cloture vote and then had final passage the same historic day, 18 December 2010. Efforts to defeat Don't Ask, Don't Tell had hit pay dirt. I watched this momentous event on TV with several friends, including Esther. We laughed, we cried, we drank champagne, and we had finally done it. In conclusion, if one were to contrast and compare the forces and rulemakers which stepped up to bring equality and justice to military women in the 70s and then military gays and lesbians in the 21st century, we can draw out some fascinating insights to be discussed at another time. For our purposes tonight, we can conclude that both initiatives require individual activists with drive, determination, networking, and leadership abilities, vision, and faith in themselves and perhaps their religious faith or belief system. And yes, they had their shipmates and their buddies in whom they trusted to get the job done. These individuals were willing to come alive and stick their necks out for justice and freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. said it best, quote, "Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals." Unquote, Martin Luther King Jr. Well, thank you for sharing my perspective of this important story. I do want to mention We Are Family, too, because I feel so proud of it. Those are 37 powerful letters, and I urge you to just skim it if you don't have time. But I was particularly, I had to do this in 3 weeks, be the editor, and they'd come in. And I was particularly hit, by the West Point women, grads, because I think I helped women get to the academies. And so just to read those stories of West Pointers who not only were women and got through West Point, but then they had to leave because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Very powerful. They're all powerful stories.